Quick tips on this one, nothing but science and training advice. Hope you like it. Let's get to it. Is HRV, or the combination of HRV and resting heart rate, the key to knowing what training to do, when to train, when you'll get the best response? No, it's not. So I'm going to talk you through how I do use HRV, how I do use resting heart rate to inform my training, to inform my recovery, things like this, but without letting it dictate my training, and how I think you should use it as well. Let's jump into what resting heart rate and HRV in particular actually are. So I think we're all pretty familiar with resting heart rate, how many times your heart beats in 1 minute at rest. So I tend to take this overnight using a device called Ringcon, which is just like a smart ring. Not sponsored by them, just got them because there's no subscription. Now HRV is a little bit more complicated. It's a variation in the time between heartbeats. So imagine your resting heart rate is 60 beats per minute, that's 1 beat every second, and imagine it was perfectly consistent. HRV would be 0. But there's a little bit of time difference between all those beats, so that variation is your HRV. So what drives this? So essentially, I think of there as being 2.5 main drivers of this. The first two are your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system. So parasympathetic, your rest and digest system, your sympathetic, your fight or flight system. So I think we've all been there. You're just out on a ride in the savannah and you start getting chased by a lion. Oh yeah, that happens to me all the time. And obviously you get this big adrenaline rush, there's a stress response, things like that. Now that's an acute response, and that's really good for performance, like going hard. But if we're getting too much of this all the time, it's chronic, that's not good for performance. And so this is what you'll see in HRV. So you'll see it decrease if you've got too much of the sympathetic nervous system sort of like overriding things. And likewise, it'll go up if the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant. And generally that's going to be better for training adaptation, sort of means you're ready to handle load and things like that. Now, so what's the last half thing I'm talking about there? Well, it's resting heart rate as well in combination with this. So if you just think about what we're actually measuring, so the difference in time between heartbeats, if your resting heartbeat is a lot higher, then there's less time for there to be variation between heartbeats. That's going to have an effect as well. If your resting heart rate is going up, your HRV is likely naturally going to come down with it. Now these two things do tend to have a bit of a seesaw, because high resting heart rate, lower HRV is associated with being like stressed and tired and things like that. But also just know that higher resting heart rate is just naturally going to lead to a lower HRV just because of the measurement. So how have I used this in my training and to inform my training? Well, I don't use it day to day. So I don't look at my HRV or heart rate in the morning and go, oh, better not do efforts today, too tired or something like that. What I do is look at the trend over the medium to long term. For example, I'll throw some graphs up here. You look at my resting heart rate and HRV for the past year. And you can see these periods where I was really struggling a little bit, periods where I was going really well. So if you look at that period, it's about around July, I was really flying, built into that, everything was going up. Then I went to do my race block in China, got sick during that, and then now you see HRV plummet, resting heart rate go up. Now this is obvious, like I know I was sick, I know I was creeping. So how is it actually useful if I already know these things? Very quick interruption. If you're finding this useful, really interesting, please, most importantly, like this video, it helps a lot. And if you'd like to sign up to my email list where there's more tips, tricks, things like that about training, some race updates, or just support the channel, please check out the links in the description below. All right, back to it. And this is where I think people go wrong with HRV and resting heart rate. So they look at their stats in the morning and decide how to train. And there have been some studies that have basically tested this, where people followed either a set program or they followed HRV guided training. And the ones who used their HRVs, when the HRV was good or higher, they did more intense training. When it was low, they did less, versus following the set program. The ones who followed HRV got a better training response. But think about this logically. You would never train like that. Chances are you'd wake up in the morning, say, I feel a bit average, and therefore you would change your training, or you'd talk to your coach and say, hey, I feel a bit average, should I change my training or not? And you'd make a logical decision about that. You wouldn't just follow a set plan no matter what. Like, no plan is that good or that structured that you can't modify it or shouldn't modify it based on how you feel and what's happening in your life. And this is why I use HRV to just guide and inform how I'm going over the medium to long term, not these short-term responses. I knew I was sick in China, I knew I was struggling, that's obvious. But it was when I was coming out of that hole that I'm looking at how are things responding, am I actually getting better? And especially when you're talking a period of several months, it's really confusing at times to know, like, man, I'm really struggling for quite a long time. Is this just a lack of motivation? Is there something seriously wrong? Is it just taking some time to build back? And I was able to look at these metrics and say, yeah, it's just taking some time to build back, but everything is tracking in the right direction. It's just slow progress. And then I got to a point where I was going really well again. HRV was back to where I typically see it over a long-term trend when I'm going well. and happy days, all really good. Now these metrics aren't the only thing that determine how ready you are to perform or adapt to training. And also the devices that measure them aren't perfect. So this is why it's important not to get too carried away with them. But at the same time, what I've just described is why it's also a mistake just to completely ignore them and not track them, because you're not going to use them day to day. So what is measured can be managed. And even if you're not using this data day to day, maybe you don't even use it over the medium term. But if something does happen to you where you're a little bit tired, things like that, you can at least look at it and try to find some sort of information, some reasoning behind what might be happening, and then you can fix it. So if you don't have this information, that's really hard to do. And this holds true for lots of other types of data as well that you can then combine with these measurements to understand what's going on. So let's say you've lost a fair chunk of weight. Now that is stressful. So if we look at what is happening with these metrics like HRV, resting heart rate, we know they're influenced by chronic stress and things like that, or acute stress as well, but particularly chronic. So if you lost a lot of weight, you can sort of look at that and be like, oh man, my HRV's down, I'm struggling, and my weight's dropping, like maybe I've done this too aggressively or something like that. Maybe you've had a big change in training load. It was too aggressive and your HRV's plummeted or something like that. Or maybe you're doing these things and HRV's really going up, you're performing well. Just understand that like, okay, like it doesn't look like anything is about to happen, like I'm handling this well. Now obviously feel how you're going, like just day-to-day motivation, just all these things are going to be far more important, far more useful. But just having these extra data points, making sure they don't override your feel and things like that, of course, is just so useful to just add a little bit more complexity to the picture, be able to actually just make some more nuanced decisions, make some objective decisions rather than having to only go on feel. You can be like, here is some objective data that says this, it matches how I feel, and that allows you to make some decisions that are a little bit less emotionally driven, perhaps, depending on how things are going in your training, and ultimately that tends to lead to better outcomes. So I hope you found this useful. Please like the video if you found this useful, and I'll see you in the next one.